Here we go. All righty. So, welcome to lecture number 2 of round 2 of God and the Bard. And this time I'll be looking at the relationship between sin, trauma, and madness in Macbeth. And I'm hoping I'll have a reasonably familiar audience for Macbeth. I imagine most of you probably had it inflicted on you at school. So it's I hope a reasonably familiar one for most of you. So let's have a look. So okay, so the title of today's talk is Full of Scorpions is My Mind, Madness and Trauma in Macbeth. Few ideas are as persistent or as quietly damaging as the belief that mental suffering is a sign of moral failure. Even today, when we speak more carefully and compassionately about mental health than previous generations, the old suspicion lingers that a breakdown in one's mental health must mean weakness, that despair must signal guilt, that an unraveling mind is somehow evidence of a life gone wrong. In a Christian context, this suspicion often takes a theological shape. We might ask whether madness is a punishment from God, a test of faith, or a consequence of sin that has finally come due. These ideas have been explored most effectively in Shakespeare's shortest tragedy, Macbeth. This play is most often examined and discussed within the context of political power struggles, of the dangers of ambitious men wanting the top job, and of that ravenous desire being punished by madness. But Shakespeare's play also asks whether mental collapse might be the most reasonable response to unbearable moral and psychological strain. The Scottish play is one of the most searing examinations of mental collapse ever written, but it offers us no easy explanations or answers. Here's a brief plot summary for anyone whose memories of it from school are hazy. So the Scottish Lord Macbeth receives a prophecy from 3 witches that he will become King of Scotland, prompting him and his ambitious wife to plan and execute the murder of King Duncan in his sleep and seize the throne. However, consumed by guilt, hallucinations, and paranoia at this misdeed, Macbeth descends into tyranny, murdering ever more people to secure his position, while Lady Macbeth descends into madness and eventually commits suicide. Ultimately, Macbeth is defeated and killed by the nobleman Macduff, who helps restore rightful leadership to Scotland. The play has proved extremely popular ever since its creation, as the trope of the desperate man who will do anything for power and recognition is sadly a timeless one. The titular role is a challenging one, as it demands both strength and fragility to be able to convince as both a battle-hardened soldier and as a brittle man whose mind unravels too fast for him to understand what is happening to him. It is a gift of a part for any performer, and the role has attracted some extraordinarily talented actors. Ian McKellen, Laurence Olivier, Denzel Washington, Orson Welles, David Tennant, Alec Guinness, Anthony Hopkins, Patrick Stewart, Kenneth Branagh, Peter O'Toole, Sean Bean, James McAvoy, Ralph Fiennes, and Charlton Heston, to name but a very few. Not only have there been many incredible actors playing the role, but the play has also been taken out of its medieval Scottish setting and performed in an almost limitless number of other settings and times. We have seen Macbeth within the context of modern gang warfare, where the thanes are transformed into competing mafia bosses. We've seen it in a totalitarian Soviet-esque setting, where one dictator is ousted by another. We've seen it in the restaurant business, where Macbeth wants to be the owner, not just the head chef. We've seen it in corporate boardrooms where rival companies seek to topple each other and establish dominance. And we've even seen Macbeth performed in feudal Japan in Akira Kurosawa's influential adaptation Throne of Blood. The details may change, but the story always works, because Shakespeare isn't simply writing about 11th century Scotland. He is writing about a temptation found in every age, the desire to seize power, keep power, and justify almost anything in order to hold on to it. Macbeth's rapacious desire for the throne and his disruption of the divinely sanctioned natural order meant that early literary criticism of this play tended to view his descent into madness through a specifically Christian-tinted lens. Here was a play that demonstrated to all good Christians everywhere the dangers and punishments due to the prideful, ambitious, and sinful amongst us. At the time of writing, monarchs were viewed as God's representatives on earth. So to kill a king was to commit a sacrilegious act and to disrupt the great chain of being. This hierarchy was a concept derived from Plato and Aristotle and became Christianized during the medieval period. To defy this chain meant to defy God. Therefore, Macbeth's psychological disintegration and bloody downfall were seen as the only right and proper punishments for such a flagrant abuse of divinely ordered hierarchy. This viewpoint was powerfully influenced by biblical stories of those who had gone astray and were divinely punished. For his disbelief in God, Nebuchadnezzar becomes beast-like, eating grass like an animal. Saul is afflicted by an evil spirit after disobeying God, and there is even a whole book of the Old Testament devoted to the torments of poor Job, who tears his clothes, shaves his head, and endures deep emotional anguish after his many and varied God-sanctioned, Satan-administered tests. It could even be argued that Judas Iscariot, that most infamous of traitors, goes insane due to his remorse at selling Jesus out, and that his suicide was the ultimate expression of madness and despair, a fitting punishment for the enormity of his betrayal. Dante famously placed Judas in the ninth circle of hell in the Divine Comedy, with Satan himself mercilessly crunching on him for eternity while clawing the flesh of his back, unable to move, speak, or escape the torment of being the devil's #1 snack forever. In case you're curious, the two other individuals on the two side faces there are Cassius and Brutus, the two Romans who betrayed Julius Caesar. It would therefore be very easy for us to fall into the trap of thinking that Macbeth's decision to murder his monarch was a bloodthirsty act of a rapacious lord unhappy with his station in life. But the reality was not so simple. During the opening battle of the play, brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, has brandished steel which smoked with bloody execution, and he has entered the battle with gusto. Once Macbeth has carved out his passage and faces his enemy, he is pitiless. He is described as having unseamed a man from the nave to the chaps and fixed his head upon the battlements. In other words, cut him open from the navel to the cheeks, beheaded him, and then made a public show of the severed head, which neatly foreshadows what will happen to him too. Spoiler alert. Macbeth is introduced to us through extreme violence, and his killing of his enemy is presented to us in highly graphic terms. While to our modern and squeamish ears this seems a horrific act of psychopathic proportions, Macbeth is in fact merely doing what all early medieval aristocrats would have done, practicing and perfecting the art of war as he would have been trained to do from boyhood. In his excellent book, The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, Ian Mortimer, who also wrote the book 1415 I mentioned in last week's lecture, Ian Mortimer outlines the grueling process of training for war. The sons of the nobility are taught to ride almost as soon as they can walk, and to handle weapons while still children. From the age of 7, a boy of noble birth may be sent to serve as a page in another lord's household, where he would learn courtesy, riding, hunting, and the use of more sophisticated and larger weapons. By the time he reached adolescence, a young nobleman was expected to be competent with sword, dagger, and lance, as well as the bow. Bruises, broken bones, and exhaustion were all taken for granted as he trained, and his adult life, which began much earlier than our 18 or 21-year-old threshold, was wholly defined by war, or the readiness for it. So Macbeth's service to his lord is therefore a culmination of a lifetime of training of mind and body in the expectation of recognition and reward. After the battle, King Duncan even says to him, "I have begun to plant thee, and will labour to make thee full of growing." So an expectation of great reward is created for Macbeth, and then it is not bestowed. Instead, Duncan throws the 11th century equivalent of a hand grenade in when he announces, "Sons, kinsmen, thanes, and you whose places are the nearest, know we will establish our estate upon our eldest, Malcolm, whom we name hereafter the Prince of Cumberland." That is the last thing Macbeth expected to hear. Malcolm's promotion to Prince of Cumberland is a major stumbling block to Macbeth's ascendancy, despite being awarded the traitorous Thane of Cawdor's land and titles, and he notes as much. The Prince of Cumberland. That is a step on which I must fall down, or else o'erleap, for in my way it lies. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, he's not Duncan's son. Why should he think he should be named as heir anyway? Because of the precedent long set by Irish, Scottish, and Manx lordship of tanistry, whereby the most capable, strongest, or most militarily experienced man would be elected to succeed the clan chief, rather than the English system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits automatically from his father, regardless of merit or ability. As a cousin of Duncan and a successful warrior, Macbeth had every right to believe that he could be named as heir after his meritorious service in Duncan's wars, rather than the boy Malcolm, who has unearned honours heaped on him by his father, despite not even fighting in the opening skirmish. Now, while I do not seek to justify Macbeth's subsequent conduct, a certain amount of resentment and irritation on his part is understandable, as not only is he not named heir despite being employee of the month, his shame and frustration are compounded by the play's nepo baby Malcolm gaining titles and honours from daddy simply by being the monarch's son. Thankfully, the days when a monarch would use their power and influence to promote and protect their spoilt and cosseted son is a thing of the long distant past. Once the carrots of the Thane of Cawdor and the kingship are dangled in front of him by the three witches and their prophecies, Macbeth's interest is stirred to such a degree that he hastens to acquaint his wife, Lady Macbeth, with the tidings. Her first appearance in this play outlines her as a woman capable of great perspicacity and boldness, as she muses on what this news will mean for him in one of Shakespeare's greatest soliloquies. Glamis, thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou art promised. Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it. What thou wouldst highly, that wouldst thou holily. Wouldst not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win. Thou'dst have, great Glamis, that which cries, thus thou must do if thou have it, and that which rather thou dost fear to do, than wishest should be undone. Hie thee hither, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valour of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round, which fate and metaphysical aid doth seem to have thee crowned withal. It is a bracing introduction to this character, not least because she so openly criticises her husband's nature, too full of the milk of human kindness, that he doesn't think tactically enough to catch the nearest way, and that he needs his wife to pour her spirits in his ear to goad him into doing what needs to be done. She notes that he would not want to play false, yet would be happy to win wrongly. In other words, he wants to have the omelette without having to break any eggs. This is quite the juxtaposition to the bloodthirsty brute we heard about at the start. Could this be an initial indicator of his vulnerability and mental fragility? That off the battlefield, he is actually an indecisive, dependent, perhaps even timid man who shrinks from needless violence even when it will benefit him. Whatever bravado he may put on for his fellow thanes, Lady Macbeth knows him too well, telling him in the same scene, "Your face, my thane, is as a book where men may read strange matters," and that he must look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. An obviously biblical allusion, exhorting our tragic hero to deceive and beguile his guests, just as Satan did in Eden. Lady Macbeth knows that for whatever reason he needs a push into doing what must be done. She believes in him and what he deserves. Remember how he's been slighted by Duncan, and she will fight for that desert with all her intellectual might. However set on it she might be, though, he is far harder to convince, in large part due to fear of eternal damnation. Later the same evening, he wrestles with the possible consequences of the murder, both earthly and divine, in another great soliloquy. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success, but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here. But here, upon this bank and shoal of time, we jump the life to come. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions which, being taught, return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. He's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then, as his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. And pity, like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. And then he is interrupted by the entrance of Lady Macbeth. In this soliloquy, Macbeth is acutely conscious of the burden of morality, as he wants a world where bad actions could trammel up the consequence, in other words, entrap and imprison the consequences. But of course, in Christianity, this is impossible, as sin is never just private or hidden. But even removing the religious element for a moment, when has killing a king ever stopped just there? Violence proliferates and breeds further violence, but he is rolling the dice nonetheless, gambling on getting his happily ever after upon an act of extraordinary brutality. Macbeth is fully aware of his religion's orthodoxy, reminding himself and us of Christian doctrine. Yet he is aware that karma will come back to bite him, as seen in his fear that this even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. His betrayal is horrific, both as a relative and as a supposedly loyal subject. The celestial language becomes ever more expansive, with Macbeth fearing that the whole host of heaven's cherubim, riding the winds to spread the news of Duncan's murder to all, that the whole world will be drowned in tears. God is watching, and is ready with his judgment, but sin is already enslaving Macbeth, as one freely chosen sin makes the next one easier. At this point in the play, Macbeth's understanding of his predicament is almost entirely theological. He fears judgment, damnation, and divine justice. Yet what follows in later scenes is striking. Shakespeare never shows God punishing Macbeth. Instead, the punishment emerges from within Macbeth himself, through sleeplessness, hallucinations, hypervigilance, and intrusive thoughts. The language of theology in the play gradually gives way to the language of the mind, and this is seen most clearly in his next great soliloquy, where, after deciding to go through with the murder, Macbeth sees a most unsettling vision en route to Duncan's bedchamber. Is this a dagger which I see before me? The handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain? I see thee yet, in form as palpable as this which now I draw. Thou marshallest me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before. There's no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. This is a thrilling moment in performance where we first start to see our tragic hero crumble. It begins in uncertainty, with repeated questions, making his uncertainty psychologically troubling. He is not mad yet, but he is beginning to wonder if his reality is reliable. The passivity of his speech is also striking. The dagger reaches towards him, not the other way round, and this preserves a certain ambiguity. Is this Satan tempting him? One of the witch's supernatural deceptions? Is this God testing him like Job or Abraham? Is this his own unconscious desire? For the audience of 1606, all four explanations are possible. But for us, a fifth explanation presents itself, a hallucination brought on by trauma and the heat-oppressed brain. Obviously, Shakespeare had no neuroscience, but he instinctively links disrupted perception with a disrupted mind. And of course, of all the things Macbeth could have hallucinated, a crown, or Duncan's face, or the fires of hell, it is a dagger that materializes to his senses. As an object with which he has been familiar his whole life, training, killing, and winning glory with it, now it follows him home off the battlefield and into his imagination. The evocative and gruesome imagery of the sanguineous dagger only intensifies his agitation, especially with the suggestive pulsing of the gouts of blood, the life force of another man ebbing away under its blade. Even the very anticipation of violence makes him witness the murder before it even occurs, ramping up the tension and the excitement for the audience. And then for one glorious moment, his rational mind wins, correctly diagnosing the hallucination, recognizing that it is the bloody business that informs thus to his eyes, demonstrating that he is still, at this point, capable of insight. But if the punishment begins before the sin is even committed, are we still looking at divine judgment? Or are we watching the catastrophic disintegration of a soldier whose mind can no longer distinguish anticipation from reality? Given the brutal and grueling childhood training regime and subsequent military campaigns, is it possible that we are not looking at a psychopath or someone who willfully defies the Judeo-Christian concept of kingship, but instead a PTSD-afflicted man who is tormented by the constant bloodshed of battle and who has now reached his breaking point? While there have been many names for what we now call PTSD, battle fatigue, operational exhaustion, and I think the most famous was shell shock, of course, in the First World War. There was no explicit name for it during Shakespeare's era, although about 100 years after he was writing, it was described as soldier's heart, which I think is probably the most beautiful description of all. Nevertheless, the condition was clearly recognised in Shakespeare's time. In one of his earliest plays, Henry IV, Part 1, written in 1597, the Lady Percy laments how her soldier husband, Harry Hotspur, yes, of Tottenham Hotspur fame, although the club came after he did, has been affected by his experiences in war, and her description of what we would now call PTSD is probably one of the most accurate presentations of the condition ever laid out. Tell me, sweet lord, what is it that takes from thee thy stomach, pleasure, and thy golden sleep? Why dost thou bend thine eyes upon the earth, and start so often when thou sitt'st alone? Why hast thou lost the fresh blood in thy cheeks, and given my treasures and rights of thee to thick-eyed musing and cursed melancholy? In thy faint slumbers I by thee have watched, and heard thee murmur tales of iron wars, speak terms of manage to thy bounding steed, cry, courage to the field! And thou hast talked of sallies and retires, of trenches and tents, of palisadoes, frontiers, parapets, of basilisks, of cannon, of culverin, of prisoners' ransom, and of soldiers slain, and all the currents of a heady fight. Thy spirit within thee hath been so at war, and thus hath so bestirred thee of thy sleep, that beads of sweat have stood upon thy brow like bubbles in a late disturbed stream. And in thy face strange motions have appeared, such as we see when men restrain their breath on some great sudden hest. Lack of sleep, lack of appetite for food or intimacy, jumping suddenly, melancholy, cold sweats, nightmares, scowls, and sudden exclamations are all recognised symptoms of the condition today. Shakespeare builds upon this foundation of war-based trauma laid early in his career and expands upon it psychologically within the character of Macbeth a decade later. While the dagger does not actually present the murder, while Shakespeare does not actually present the murder to us, its brutality is no less shocking for it. The dagger of the mind, he speaks of, directs Macbeth to Duncan's chambers, but we never actually see the murder, which of course makes it far bloodier and more gruesome in our mind's eye. But the murder of an old king is one thing. Dealing with the what next is an entirely different matter, and the consequences of this dastardly deed are felt almost immediately. Upon his return from Duncan's bedchamber, Macbeth is covered in blood, staring at his hands utterly drenched from the horrid deed. It is an electrifying moment in performance. He has screwed his courage to the sticking place, as Lady Macbeth advised him earlier, and he has done it. But his horrifying appearance begs an interesting question that years of my school students have debated gleefully. What exactly did Macbeth do to Duncan to emerge so blood-spattered? After some graphic and often absurd suggestions, smashing in his head, miss. What, with a pair of teeny tiny daggers? Unlikely. My students usually settle for some kind of botched stabbing to the belly or chest, and then a slicing open of the throat for good measure. Talk about don't ask a question if you're not ready to hear the answer. While Shakespeare is doomed to disappoint my students because he never provides a definitive answer, the question is an insightful one nonetheless. Why on earth would a highly skilled combat veteran make such an unholy mess of killing an unarmed man in his sleep who presents no physical or military challenge? My students usually argue that when standing by the bedside, he suffers from some kind of hesitancy, doubt, or even a burst of rage at being overlooked one too many times, that either way his stabbing is frenzied and uncontrolled. It has long been a source of fascination that a character who, on the field of battle, comfortably unseamed a man from the nave to the chaps and fixed his head upon the battlements, would now go to pieces at the prospect of killing his king to get a throne he has long fantasized about gaining anyway? The answer would appear to be that it is because Macbeth's conduct on the battlefield is sanctioned killing within the context of a war, where he is matched with an enemy armed just as he is, and there for the same purpose as him. But to kill an unarmed, slightly tipsy old man in his sleep while that man was a guest of honour in Macbeth's home is wholly different. The murder of Duncan is characterised as the murder of an innocent victim who did not resist, whose virtues and meek qualities will plead for him like angels trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. Not only are there echoes of Jesus' murder, but also echoes of Abel, murdered by his kinsman. And after that murder, God says, "The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." Duncan's blood, covering Macbeth, cries out to him and to God, but the Almighty's punishment is already being exacted. When Lady Macbeth asks what he heard on his way back from Duncan's chamber, he speaks frantically of the other guests, who startled themselves awake, but they did say their prayers and addressed them again to sleep, ensuring they completed their prayers properly by saying, "God bless us and amen," but he is unable to make reply. Listening their fear, I could not say amen when they did say, "God bless us." Oh, consider it not so deeply. But wherefore could I not pronounce amen? I had most need of blessing, and amen stuck in my throat. This was not just a slip of the tongue. It is evidence that something catastrophic has happened to his soul. This most profound rupture in his own moral code and the natural order is the catalyst for his mental downfall. The Hebrew word amen means truly, or so be it, or may this be fulfilled. So to say it means participation in God's blessing, but Macbeth cannot. The fact he describes being in need of blessing becomes evidence that God's blessing is no longer available to him. Like Judas, he does not despair because God refuses forgiveness, but because he cannot imagine it. Macbeth now sees evidence of his own crime in everything he experiences. His theology now becomes his psychology. He feared deep damnation, and now everything he does becomes evidence of that damnation. He experiences panic, dissociation, intrusive thoughts, and an inability to speak naturally, all while desperately trying to pray to a God who seems deaf. But I think it is perhaps more convincing to argue not that God has rejected Macbeth, but that Macbeth becomes imprisoned in his own mind, and he builds that prison bar by bar until the play's catastrophic conclusion and the total erasure of his conscience. Lady Macbeth sees his panic and cautions him, "These deeds must not be thought after these ways, so it will make us mad." How right she is. Macbeth then immediately realizes that his physical and mental peace is destroyed forever. "Methought I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more.' Macbeth does murder sleep. The innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labour's bath, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second cause, chief nourisher in life's feasts." What do you mean? "Still, it cried no sleep no more to all the house. Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." Who was it that thus cried? Why, worthy Thane, you do unbend your noble strength to think so brain-sickly of things. Just like the dagger in the previous scene, we are never clear if this voice really exists. We can choose to view it as a supernatural proclamation of divine judgment or as a hallucination brought on by extreme emotional shock, but either way, Macbeth will never rest easy again in this play. Psalm 4 tells us, "I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety." Sleep is repeatedly presented throughout Scripture as an act of trust in God. Every night, the sleeper relinquishes control and rests under God's providence. To lose the capacity for sleep is therefore not merely to lose physical rest, but to lose the confidence of God's care. Macbeth fears he has permanently destroyed the mechanism by which he might soothe himself, the balm of hurt minds, and that he has doomed himself to a life without solace, healing, or peace of mind. The personification of sleep as something innocent that fixes all our woes, as something that can be murdered, is profoundly troubling, as if such a thing can be killed, murdered even, then what does that mean for the mind of the person who can no longer sleep? We have all had some sleepless nights in our time, and we feel the effects for days afterwards. Deliberate sleep deprivation is even designated as a form of torture by the UN, as the consequences are so severe. impaired cognitive function, destabilized emotional health through anxiety and mood swings, and even weakening the body's immune and cardiovascular systems. But for Shakespeare's audience, sleep no more would have sounded almost like a curse of exile from divine peace, not to mention a torturous experience for anybody. When we are troubled, our sleep is often the only place where we can escape from what troubles us, even if that is ourselves. Macbeth's punishment is not just to feel exhausted, but to never have a break from his mind ever again. Lady Macbeth's concern that he must not think so brain-sickly of things is fascinating. Even when she's trying to dismiss his fears, she reaches instinctively for the language of mental disturbance rather than divine punishment. She knows that, to quote another Shakespeare play, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Macbeth's mind is already on the turn, but I would argue that his intense agitation and paranoia are not in fact irrational, but perfectly reasonable reactions to a psychologically overwhelming experience. The dagger, the voice that cried sleep no more are two of the hallucinations Macbeth experiences, but his third hallucination marks a turning point for his mental stability. Once he has the throne, Macbeth's paranoia is not settled, as of course he has the same concern that every usurper has. What if it is done to me? And what about the people who knew? Chillingly, Macbeth turns on his friend Banquo and orders him and his young son murdered, as he wishes to forestall one of the witch's prophecies that Banquo's children would reign in Scotland. The son, Fleance, escapes, but Banquo is murdered. At the regnal feast, to celebrate Macbeth's coronation, Macbeth sees a most horrific vision, the ghost of Banquo staring at him in stony silence. Naturally, this causes Macbeth to, in the memorable words of one of my students, go absolutely bonkers, and he starts screaming and shouting. It is obvious from Macbeth's words that nobody else can see Banquo's ghost, and while the actor playing Banquo is often present for this thrilling moment, just as many productions have an empty stool, which would further confirm Macbeth's inability to distinguish between reality and imagination. Now, if most of us saw someone who we thought was dead, we would quite rightly be deeply shaken and unsettled. Imagine seeing your deceased parent, your child, your lover, your sibling, and that this sighting occurred while you were at a large gathering of people whose help and support you needed. While it is easy to sit in a theatre audience and laugh at the apparent insanity of Macbeth screaming at an empty chair, would we not do the same if we believed sincerely that we saw this person, despite knowing full well that they were not alive? We might also scream and cry and utter exclamations of disbelief, especially if we have not been sleeping and were plagued by a guilty conscience. While it's bad enough for anyone to go bonkers at an empty chair, for a monarch to display such signs of instability would have been looked upon with the gravest of suspicion, even the hint of such speculation would have been viewed as treason. A monarch's right to rule was absolute, and their authority must be unquestioned. So the gathered thanes and lords have no choice but to watch from the sidelines as their monarch loses control of his emotions and embarrasses himself in front of all the men whose support he needs to legitimize his rule. As was famously observed in Hamlet, madness in great ones must not unwatched go. And after all, who wants a leader who is not of sound mind? But the damage is done. He recognises what he has done, not only to Duncan, but to himself, as he laments, "Full of scorpions is my mind." This vivid image suggests living venom inside his own head, dispensed by a merciless creature that stings repeatedly with no thought of its victim's pain. And if there is a better metaphor for what intrusive and harmful thoughts feel like, I have yet to hear it. There is also a clear biblical resonance, as scorpions appear repeatedly in the Old and New Testaments as symbols of judgment, curses, torment, and the wilderness. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells us that he has given us the power to tread upon snakes and scorpions and all the forces of the enemy, and nothing will ever harm you. But Macbeth's scorpions cannot be trampled. Previously, he was afraid of losing our men, then of seeing daggers, then losing sleep, then seeing ghosts. But now he no longer fears anything external, as the poison is now internal. His mind has become hostile territory, as it is under such severe strain that there is no remedy for him. His sin has become his punishment, and his punishment his sin, a profoundly Augustinian idea where sin carries its own punishment embedded within it. By the time we reach Macbeth's demise in Act 5, he is utterly nihilistic. His famous tomorrow and tomorrow speech is his absolute rock bottom, not where he feels shock or fear or horror, but where he feels nothing at all. Another superbly accurate description of what depression feels like. His life is now a walking shadow, like an existence to a cheap actor who plays his role for a short time and then is heard no more. To hear Macbeth describe God's gift of life as a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, is the ultimate sacrilege, denying any meaning or purpose to either God or man, and placing Macbeth utterly beyond the point of saving psychologically. His spiritual and mental degradation is complete and total. The only thing that can remove the agony is death, and that is bestowed swiftly. Nowadays, we would rightly feel uneasy about using the word madness to describe actual mental illness. We might call someone who runs ultramarathons or who jumps out of planes for fun as crazy. Or our friend who just keeps taking him back no matter how many times he's let her down is just insane for giving him yet another chance. Our American cousins will use the term mad as a synonym for angry, whereas those of us from the old world might use the word mad to describe a night out that went on far too long and ended at 5 a.m. with everyone looking like they're in a Hieronymus Bosch painting. But as a term to describe actual mental struggle, we might well wince before we used the word mad in earnest. While Macbeth's scorpion-filled mind is partly due to the sting of conscience, it is also the poison of trauma, of a man trapped within a culture that trained him to kill efficiently, but also offered him no language for what killing does to the mind. If we learn that someone's mind is full of scorpions, do we view that as punishment for a corrupted soul? Or does Shakespeare suggest that the deepest punishments of sin are those we inflict upon ourselves? That mental deterioration is, far from being irrational or crazy, actually a perfectly intelligible human response to unbearable trauma. Perhaps that is why Macbeth still speaks to us today. We have changed the language with which we describe mental suffering, but we have not escaped the reality of it. We still struggle to understand what violence does to those who commit it, how the mind can become a place of torment for us. Shakespeare's genius lies not in answering those questions, but in recognizing them 4 centuries before we even had names for them. Macbeth feared that hell awaited him after death. Shakespeare's deeper tragedy is that long before death arrived, Macbeth had already begun to carry hell within himself, just like Satan in John Milton's Paradise Lost. Macbeth's mind was indeed full of scorpions all along. Thank you very much. We will move to our Q&A now. I'll see you on the other Zoom.